Hello, everyone. My name is Chris Ayers, and today we're going to be talking about dev containers. We're going to work with them in VS Code and in GitHub code spaces. So, I am a senior customer engineer at Microsoft. I am on the Fast Track for Azure team, which is part of Azure Engineering, and I usually help customers build and deploy things to Azure. And one of my passions has been for many years is DevOps, SRE, platform engineering, anything that requires some sort of optimization to building, releasing, developing things. So I do a lot of infrastructure as code. I do a lot of GitHub and Azure DevOps. And I'm also one of the lead organizers for DevOps Days Tampa Bay. I'm on the socials. I have some blog, and I work in the public a lot. So all of my samples, all my code are out on GitHub. Feel free to go take a look. All my talks are out there too with markdown slides like this one. So today we're going to talk about, the prereqs for using this, what they are, how they work, why to use dev containers, and how to build one. We're going to do lots of demos, lots of live stuff. So this should be a lot of fun. Now, I'm going to be doing it in VS Code, so Visual Studio Code, and I'm using Docker. So Docker Desktop locally with WSL, the Windows subsystem for Linux. You can use a remote Docker host. You also can use a Kubernetes cluster if you have kubectl set up. You also can use IntelliJ and some other tooling with it. There is a dev container CLI. But for the purposes of this, I'm going to be focusing on the VS Code integration and code spaces. So what are dev containers? You might think, hey, cool, I'm just going to run things in a Docker. And I'm going to make a Docker image for my dev environment. Kind of. Like I could sit there and go make a Docker file, and I could define every little thing. I could write a script. I could fully automate everything. Dev containers is actually a open source specification that multiple tool makers in the community have adopted. And so this lets you define the images and containers you want and the tooling around it. Like you can apply customizations, you can mount file systems, and then inside your dev container, you can have tools, apps, debuggers, you can have scripts, all sorts of stuff. You're going to love this. And so why do I care about dev containers? Like, why do I even bother? Well, I can't tell you how many jobs I've been at, how many places I've worked where I wanted to get started. I got hired, I was trying to get onboarded, and it took weeks of tweaking my machine, one, waiting for the machine, two, tweaking it, getting the software, getting the licenses. Oh, I need to put this file in this folder. Oh, I need to set this setting to this. It's painful. And it wastes time and resources for everybody, especially when you want to get started. So onboarding people and getting people set up quickly is the key to this, and it is incredible. Another problem I've faced is, I've worked with, small teams and large teams, and new versions of stuff comes out, and I've seen developers or engineers just instantly upgrade to the latest thing. A couple years ago, I was on Node 12 and somebody upgraded to Node 14 and was writing code that worked fine for them, but it broke on my machine, which is another issue altogether, talking about containers and pipelines and tooling. But that was a problem. So we can have more consistent versions of things, more consistent tooling. If I use VS Code and somebody else uses completely different extensions for spell checking or different setups, that can be a problem. I've also been a consultant, and today I work with lots of customers, and so if I'm pulling down code that uses different versions of .NET or Python or Java or Node, system conflicts happen. So if I have to set up Node 14, 18 for this one customer, does it break this other tool that I'm using? Oh, I'm using the latest version of this tool for this thing, but now this other package broke. And so that can be a real pain, having to try to switch. That's why we have tooling like MVM and some of those, but it's still a pain and it's a problem. And you check out code, the documentation might say before you do anything, you have to run step 1, 2, 3. People miss that very easily, but you can automate some of these startup tasks and these routine tasks through some of the hooks that Dev Containers provides. And so Dev Containers and having a Dev Container lets you kind of optimize that inner loop really well. Like I can still use my local VS Code with my font. I can have, my Cascadia code, nerd fonts with all my little ligatures and toolings. I can have dark mode, but I can also have the debugger. So I can, set a breakpoint, debug things. I can use my local browser that I like, Firefox or Edge. I can, do the CLI tools for, the Azure CLI and Bicep. I've got everything I need in my Dev Container. And that Dev Container can also be used in the CI process to help build your images or software so it's consistent with what's running locally is what you're using to build. And part of how this works is of course, the client, VS Code, that's got all my theming, my fonts, my colors, the source code I check out, but it will connect into that Dev Container using that open source VS Code server. Additional extensions can be running inside that. I can do my debugging there. I can have processes. I can mount the file system. I can do all the stuff I would do normally. And it's like you might not even know you're working in a container. That is the ideal scenario. You start a Node application, you click on a link, and you're browsing something at port 5000. You don't even care. So once you've installed the extensions, and I'm going to show you the extensions, I'm going to walk you through this process. You can add Dev Container files, and when you add them, it's going to ask you about templates. Like what do you want to build on? Do you want an OS like Alpine or Debian or Ubuntu, or do you want to have something more targeted? So they have some that are very based on like languages like Go or C# or Rust, or maybe it's a tool. Like I just want to use some Kubernetes, or I want to use Jekyll, or I want to do Docker in Docker. And so, they've got all these different templates that are supported by the Dev Container spec maintainers like Alpine and Anaconda, F#, Java, and Go. And you can even see they have databases or additional configurations set up ready for you to go. But in addition to the spec maintainers, we have the whole community contributing these base images to do, additional type of development. All these are out on containers.dev, which is where the spec is. But not only that, once you add a dev container, it creates this .dev container folder with a dev container JSON and maybe a Docker file. It depends on the image. Sometimes they're hosted on like a container registry and it's just a reference to an image. Sometimes it's a Docker file. But in addition to that, you can add extensions. So, hey, VS Code, I want you to include these extensions with my dev container. I want you to include some features, which I'll show you. It's really cool. I want certain settings to these values, or those startup tasks, or ports forwarded, or any, there's lots of options. Now, when I said features, I mean like features. Like that could be a cool tool, like the Azure CLI or the developer CLI. That could be kubectl. That could be Terraform. I could have like Trivy, or maybe it's a new language. I need to install NPM or Node or Python. And so there's tons of features. Like we have to have a search box here. Like if I want to look for the Azure CLI or Bicep, there's ones hosted by the maintainers. So we have that. But there's also that full community support that are building tools. So we have tons of capabilities that we can add very quickly to any of our projects. So we write this dev container file, and maybe I don't have a powerful machine on my desk. Maybe I don't have a license for Docker Desktop because of, my business doesn't buy a license for that. And, I can play with it locally at home with the free license, but I want to be able to use these at work. Well, you can use GitHub code spaces. You don't have to worry about a big machine. You don't have to worry about Docker Desktop. It does work with VS Code. It works with IntelliJ. It works in your browser. So you don't even have to install anything if you just have a browser. You can spin up multiple size machines, and even if you don't go through the effort of creating and customizing a dev container, they have this default universal dev container image that has all sorts of stuff already set up. The most popular languages already defined. So I'm going to come here. I'm going to I have an empty folder, and we're going to fire up VS Code. And so first I want to do is show you the extensions. So we have the dev container extension. So I'm going to just make some room. And this is the dev container extension. You can just install it. It's got 23 million downloads, and it's developed by Microsoft. The other one that I would highly recommend if you're looking at running code spaces or using GitHub is the GitHub Codespaces extension. So this lets you actually connect your local Visual Studio Code up to GitHub. So now that we've got the extensions installed and I have a completely empty directory, and if you look down here at the bottom left, you'll notice I am on my local Ubuntu, my WSL2. I'm going to hit the command palette button, and I've got a bunch of ones I've used, but dev containers, like we've got lots of options. We can clone right into a dev container. We can attach to stuff. We can install the CLI. We can do all sorts of things. But what we're going to do is we're actually going to add dev container configuration files. That's what we're going to do. And we can look at all those templates we talked about. So there's Alpine, there's Anaconda by the dev container maintainers, and then we've got all sorts of different capabilities by different people in the community. I'm just going to pick, I'm going to pick just a simple Debian. So it's not going to have a lot of tooling installed on it. And I'm going to add the Azure CLI. I'm going to hit OK, and I can configure stuff, but I'm just going to keep the defaults for now. And so it just ran and it added some files. And it also popped up that this contains a dev container file. So you can give your dev container a name. You can point it at an image that's out on a registry or a Docker file locally. And it added some features. So we've got a feature for the Azure CLI. We could forward ports if we wanted. We can do some customizations, which I'll show you shortly, about adding extensions and settings and stuff. But we've got one of those. And we also have a dependabot file. So dependabot will scan your code bases and tell you if something needs to be updated. Maybe it's out of date. And so this will scan your dev containers. Maybe I'm using an old feature. You can extend this to add GitHub Actions or NuGet or NPM or all sorts of different ecosystems because there are so many different things. Highly recommend using dev containers or dependabot. So I've got my dev container file. I'm going to go ahead and open in a dev container. So this is reading, and I click the button to show what it's doing. So it's doing some initialization, and then I've pulled these Docker files kind of before, and so it did show some cached layers here. There we go, some cache layers, and then it was running the Azure CLI, and now it's doing some startup, and we are now running in our dev container on Debian. So, if I come here, don't have NPM, don't have Java, but I have the Azure CLI because that's what I told it I wanted. So give me the Azure CLI. And, let me go to my local VS Code. Who am I? I'm me. And I do have NPM. So I am running in a container, and I have new tooling that is just what I defined, nothing else but what I defined. I can, if I want, I can click here or at the top, and I can just go back to being in WSL. I can get out of the container, and I can also configure my container features. So I could, if I wanted, I could come back here and add additional tooling and say, okay, and I could configure this. So I actually can do some configurations like, I want to configure the Azure CLI, or I want to configure Node, or I want to get a different version. So I have now some configuration options, and I'll show you where you get those. Like if we, yeah, I'll show you that. I'll show you that while it's rebuilding. Whoops. So we can just Control-Shift-P and rebuild our dev container. And so while that's rebuilding, which should only take a second or two, I'm going to go back up here to the feature. So I was talking about the Azure CLI. So if I click on the feature, it's actually going to take me to a repo. These should all be public. You should be able to see what they're doing, and they should tell you how to leverage it and any options that are available to customize those features and any extensions they might add when you enable that feature. So really cool information about the packages. And oh, it looks like we're back up. So if I do npm, I now have npm inside that dev container. And if we look, the one on my local machine is version 9, and the one on the dev container is version 10. So I can have two different projects. I can install and set up and configure, and I don't have to worry about conflicts with the system. So that's cool. But like I said, what if I don't have Docker available to me? I can go to repos in GitHub, and I can hit the code button, and I already have one that I've started in the past. So I'm going to go ahead and click on that just to show you I've leveraged it. So I'm going to restart it. And so this is one I've built before, and I'm restarting it. And I'm now using Visual Studio Code in the web. And it's restarting it. It's setting up that remote connection. And this is from one of my other talks that I give around GitHub Actions. So let's give it 1 sec to finish initializing export. And we can come in here and we can look at our dev containers. Like this one uses Debian, and I've added a couple of different features. And then I've also done some customizations. Let me just zoom in on this guy a little bit. So I've added some extensions that I want to show in Visual Studio when I load this dev container. Enable these extensions. So Copilot and pull requests for GitHub. I want to, when it starts up the container, I get annoyed when Visual Studio constantly asks me if I trust a repository when I just cloned it and it's mine. So I sometimes get that pop up with dev containers. So I added this to say, hey, Git, this dev container is a safe folder. So you have those options. And so I can use, I have enabled .NET and GitHub CLI. So .NET, see, I've got .NET 8 installed, ready to go. I can work with this. But this is Visual Studio in the browser. Not everyone likes that. There's another option you can actually do if you want to use code spaces. You can come down here to settings, and you can come to code spaces. If you have dot files, you can have it automatically install dot files, which is cool. Maybe you have a secret like a OpenAI API key or something that you want to be able to reference in your code spaces. You can do that. GPG verification, you can sync your settings, you can trust different repos, you can also, I want to open in VS Code. I don't want it to open in the browser. I want it to open in VS Code. I want to maybe stop my code space after 15 minutes or turn it off, or use vary my operating system. Maybe I have data sovereignty and I want to make sure it stays in a certain region. I have all those capabilities. So I'm gonna come back here and I'm gonna reopen that code space. Oh, I probably need to I need to clear my cache first, or refresh things because I made that change. So let me, see, I can also just come here and say open in VS Code. And now I'm on my local machine. and I've got that GitHub Codespace extension, and I'm opening this on my local box. So it's going to set up that remote connection to that cloud-based Codespace. And see code bytes. I'm there. And I've still got .NET 8 set up and ready to go. So this is a really cool, great experience. Well, what else can I do with this? Well, if you have the extension set up, let me close this and open a local sample just to show you some cool things. I've previously opened up Visual Studio Try Rust. And so if you have the dev container extension set up in VS Code and you bring up the command palette, I don't want to do this right now. And you bring up the command palette, you can type dev containers, and inside of dev containers here there is a an option to try a sample. I think I scrolled right. It might be because I'm already in a dev container, but this is one of those samples, and I'll show it to you. But I can set breakpoints. So I'm in Rust. I'm setting a breakpoint, and I can just go ahead and hit F5, and it's building my tooling. It's hitting my breakpoint. I'm examining things. I can mouse over. I have the same experience that I would want to have without a container running just fine. I don't even have to think about it. It just works like I expect it to. The other sample I wanted to show you was let's try Go. I believe I have a Go sample that is really cool because, you know, I might want to, I know where it is. You know, I might want to debug and open a web page. You know, so Go. Let's go find the repository. So we've got this VS Code try Go template, and you know this one. Maybe I want to make a new dev container. Maybe I want to come in here and say, do it on a branch. Maybe pick a different container. I might use that one. Maybe I want a bigger machine, and I can easily create a new code space. But I'm going to use this code space I've already run. I'm going to go ahead and open it, and you know I'm going to host a web page. I want to be able to debug a web page from a container. So I'm on my local machine running VS Code, connected to GitHub Codespaces, and I'm going to use my local browser to debug some Go code. Let's do that. So we've got our server.go, and we still got some extensions loading because I have a bunch. But we got our server.go. You know, this is where it kind of registers. And I'll go ahead and see if these finish. See if an F5 will get us there. Go ahead and launch. And just give it a sec. So we've started our remote container. We hit a debug point. Cool, continue. Or continue. But something that's neat is I can look at my port mapping. See, here's my port mapping. It's forwarded a port. So I could open my browser, but it's just spinning. Well, it's spinning because I hit a breakpoint. So my local port 9000 is being redirected to the app running in my code space. You know, I can step into it. I've got my locals I can look at. I can, you know, see my values by mousing over them. And if I say go ahead and hit the response, there it is on my page. It finally came back. So I can remove my breakpoints, you know, and I can copy that. I can go to Firefox and use my local host, and it just works. And so I'm hitting a local web page on my machine through code spaces, through a forwarded port, and connecting to that running application in the cloud. It's a really cool experience. Now, something else I just want to show before we're done is, I'm a big fan of home automation and Home Assistant. So I can go to Home Assistant on GitHub, and they use all of these different tools. They have a dev container in there for that consistency. They have all of those extensions and settings. So Python does. Please check out the documentation, try installing the extensions, try dev containers. Go ahead and give it a shot. I think you'll find it really interesting, and there's so many capabilities. Just go out to the documentation, go look around the Visual Studio Code documentation on dev containers. Like, they walk you through attaching and creating and all these advanced scenarios about different users and Kubernetes and all of that. And there's also some great documentation out on GitHub itself around their code spaces. So check out this stuff. Give me a follow. Give me a reach. Thank you, guys. I appreciate the time today.